July 19, 1945. Patience Bay off the eastern coast of Kafuto. Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye to the periscope lens, observing the faint column of smoke curling above the coastal hills. The steady chug of a locomotive drifted softly across the bay, hauling soldiers and supplies along tracks that traced the shoreline. At that instant, staring at something no submarine commander had ever seriously considered assaulting, Fluckey made a decision that would rewrite the principles of naval warfare. A submarine was about to wage war on a train. The sheer impossibility of what he was contemplating should have stopped him cold. Submarines fought ships. They torpedoed convoys, hunted destroyers, and vanished into the depths to avoid detection. They did not dispatch landing teams ashore onto enemy soil to demolish railroads. Yet there stood Commander Fluckey, already the most decorated submarine skipper in the Pacific, gazing at that distant trail of steam and thinking the unthinkable. His crew had spent months transforming the USS Barb into something entirely new. A submarine that launched rockets at coastal targets, that slipped into harbors deemed impenetrable, that survived encounters which should have ended in watery graves. Now they would attempt something never mentioned in naval manuals. They would become saboteurs. The audacity of the scheme stood in stark contrast to everything submarines were meant to do. The Gatto-class submarine USS Barb, commissioned on July 8, 1942, measured 311 feet 9 inches from bow to stern and displaced 1,326 tons on the surface. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, armed with Mark 14 torpedoes built to sink ships. Her 4 diesel engines produced 5,400 horsepower, propelling her to speeds of 20.25 knots on the surface. Beneath the waves, electric motors drove her through the depths at 875 knots. She was designed for stealth, to strike unseen and disappear into the ocean's embrace. She was not designed to send men paddling through enemy waters in rubber rafts to plant explosives on foreign soil. But Commander Fluckey had never been bound by what submarines were supposed to do. The path to this improbable moment had begun 4 years earlier in the shipyards of Groton, Connecticut. The Barb emerged from the Electric Boat Company as one of 77 Gatto-class submarines forming the backbone of America's undersea campaign against Japan. Her initial patrols in the Atlantic and Mediterranean were uneventful. 5 missions chasing. Axis blockade runners with little to show. Navy leadership recognized what many sailors already sensed. The Barb was capable of far more than her record implied. She needed the right captain. In April 1944, they found him, Eugene Fluckey, born in Washington, D.C. on October 5, 1913, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy on June 6, 1935. Before taking command of the Barb, he served on surface ships and helmed the submarine USS L-42. After completing prospective commanding officer school in New London, Connecticut, he emerged with a reputation for bold, unconventional thinking that unsettled traditional officers. At 30 years old, assuming command of his second submarine on April 27, 1944, Fluckey brought to the Barb something more dangerous than any weapon, a willingness to treat naval doctrine as a set of suggestions rather than rules. His crew nicknamed him Lucky Fluckey, partly for the impossible escapes he engineered, and partly because serving under him felt like winning a lottery of survival mixed with spectacular success. The Barb's first patrol under Fluckey left Midway Atoll on May 21, 1944, bound for the Sea of Okhotsk. Within days, the crew realized they were serving under a different breed of commander. On May 31st, Fluckey attacked and sank the freighters Kodomaru and Madras Maru in a single action. 2 days later, he steered the Barb into ice fields to evade depth charges, hiding among the pack ice where no submarine captain had ever dared go. On June 11th, he surfaced to engage 2 trawlers with deck guns, then submerged to torpedo and sink the fishing vessels Chihaya Maru and Toten Maru hours later. 2 days after that, he used his last torpedoes to destroy a passenger cargo ship. The Barb returned to Midway on July 5th, credited with sinking 15,472 tons of enemy shipping on a single patrol. The crew understood they were no longer just submariners, they were innovators. Each subsequent patrol accelerated the transformation. During the 9th patrol in August 1944, the Barb joined USS Queenfish and USS Tunny to form a wolf pack prowling the South China Sea. On August 31st, they converged on a heavily guarded convoy. While Queenfish initiated the assault, Fluckey guided the Barb through chaos, firing torpedoes that struck a tanker and freighter. Hours later, after a bird repeatedly landed on the periscope, blocking his view, Fluckey waited patiently until it flew off, then fired 3 torpedoes into the Okuni Maru, breaking the freighter in 2. Days later, between September 15th and 16th, while racing to rescue Allied prisoners from a torpedoed Japanese transport, the Barb met another convoy. Fluckey chose attack over avoidance, a decision that captured his entire philosophy of submarine warfare. 6 torpedoes from the Barb sank the 11,700-ton tanker Isusa. 3 more slammed into the 20,000-ton escort carrier Uno at 0037 hours on September 17th, one of only 4 Japanese carriers ever sunk by submarines during the war. The carrier went down that morning around 7:55. Then Fluckey pressed on to the rescue area, where the Barb's crew hauled 14 British and Australian prisoners from small rafts tossed in typhoon seas, sailors diving into perilous waters to save men adrift for days. But it was the 11th War Patrol, departing Pearl Harbor on December 19, 1944, that would earn Fluckey the Medal of Honor and seal the Barb's legend as the most dangerous submarine in the Pacific. The mission began with Fluckey tracking a Japanese convoy along the Chinese coast. On January 1, 1945, the Barb destroyed several small craft with gunfire. A week later, on January 8th, Fluckey fought a 2-hour night battle in the Formosa Strait, torpedoing and sinking the Shinyo Maru and Sano Maru. After resurfacing, he spotted another target, the passenger ship Anomaru. 3 torpedoes struck, triggering an explosion so massive it was felt nearly 4,000 yards away. Shrapnel rained from the sky like metallic hail. The Barb had hit an ammunition transport, turning night into day. 2 weeks later, in the early hours of January 22nd, 23rd, Fluckey made a decision historians would later describe as near-suicidal. He had found over 30 Japanese merchant ships anchored in Namquan Harbor on China's coast, a death trap lined with mines, shallow waters, rocks, and patrolling frigates. Naval manuals dictated submarines avoid such strongholds. Fluckey studied the harbor and simply declared, "We're going in." On a moonless night, in total darkness, the Barb crept forward through uncharted waters. The crew trusted him absolutely. They had seen him make the impossible routine. At 04:02 hours, they entered Namquan Harbor, moving through waters so shallow the submarine's keel almost scraped bottom. Fluckey weaved between patrol craft, positioning the Barb just 3,000 yards from the anchored fleet. The escape plan was exact. They would have to race out at top speed through mined waters under fire. Fluckey gave the order. The Barb launched all 10 torpedoes, 6 forward, then 4 aft, as she swung sharply. 8 found their marks, detonating across 6 ships in a series of thunderous explosions. Post-war records credited 1 confirmed sinking, though Coastwatcher reports claimed 4 ships actually went down. Chaos followed as patrol boats converged and coastal batteries opened fire. Searchlights swept across the water. Japanese aircraft scrambled into the air. Fluckey ordered emergency speed. The Barb's engines roared to 150% overload capacity, driving the submarine forward at 23.5 knots, a world speed record for submarines at that time that would stand for years. The crew felt the hull vibrating from the strain as depth charges exploded in her wake. Patrol boats fired furiously at their position. A Japanese plane arrived overhead just as the Barb reached deeper water and executed a crash dive. The submarine disappeared beneath the waves with seconds to spare. For this action, for the impossible penetration of Namquan Harbor, and the high-speed escape that defied every prediction of the submarine's capabilities, Eugene Fluckey was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The Barb received a Presidential Unit citation, but Fluckey was not finished revolutionizing submarine warfare. He had one more patrol to command, one more opportunity to prove that submarines could do things no one had imagined. The 12th Patrol would become legendary. Before departing Pearl Harbor in June 1945, Fluckey made an unusual requisition. He wanted rocket launchers installed on the Barb's deck. The Navy, accustomed to Fluckey's unconventional requests by this point, agreed. Technicians bolted a 5-in rocket launcher to the forward gun mount capable of raising to a 45-degree angle. The system could simultaneously fire a dozen Mk-10 spin-stabilized rockets, each 4 ft long and tipped with 10 lb of explosives with a range of nearly 3 km. Fluckey called them ballistic missiles, though naval doctrine had no category for submarine-launched rockets. The Barb departed Pearl Harbor on June 8 carrying 72 rockets and a commander determined to prove submarines could bombard shore installations with ordnance that didn't require surfacing to use deck guns. The crew wondered what other innovations Fluckey had planned for this patrol. The Barb arrived in the Sea of Okhotsk on June 21 and immediately began operations unlike anything in submarine warfare history. On June 22, Fluckey positioned the submarine 1 mile off the town of Sherry on Hokkaido's coast. The town of 20,000 people sat peacefully unaware as the Barb surfaced in the pre-dawn darkness at 230 hours, that's at 250 YDs offshore. Fluckey gave the order. 12 rockets screamed from the launcher, arcing through the air toward the town center. They struck factories and industrial buildings, causing damage but no major fires. The Japanese believed they were under air attack. By the time they realized what had actually occurred, the Barb had submerged and slipped away. The submarine had become the first in naval history to successfully employ rockets against shore installations. But Fluffy's true target lay further north. For the next month, the Barb conducted a campaign of harassment along the Kyofuto coast that demonstrated Fluckey's philosophy of taking the war directly to the enemy. The submarine bombarded the garrison on Tulani Island with conventional deck guns on July 2nd, destroying structures and starting fires. On July 5th, torpedoes from the Barb sank the Japanese merchant Sapporo Maru just outside Odmari Harbor. On July 8th, deck guns sank a small tug in Le Peru Strait. The submarine attacked sampans with gunfire, sank trawlers, and launched rocket attacks against the towns of Shikuka on July 3rd and Shiru. Each attack followed the same pattern. Surface under cover of darkness or early morning. Strike with overwhelming firepower. Disappear before enemy forces could respond. The Japanese began to fear what they called the ghost submarine that appeared without warning and vanished into mist. Commander Fluckey was systematically demonstrating that even late in the war, even with Japan's homeland waters supposedly secure, American submarines could operate with impunity. But on July 19th, Fluckey observed something that sparked an idea more audacious than anything he had yet attempted. Through the periscope, he watched a train moving along tracks that hugged the eastern coastline of Kyofuto. The railroad ran between the towns that dotted southern Sakhalin, carrying troops and supplies to Japanese forces still manning defenses in preparation for an Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. Fluckey studied the terrain, noting how the tracks ran close to the shore in several places. The trains operated on predictable schedules. The coastline offered approaches where a submarine could surface relatively close to shore without immediately attracting attention. An idea began forming. One sound precedented that no naval manual addressed it because no one had ever considered it possible. What if a submarine didn't just attack ships? What if it sent a landing party ashore to sabotage enemy infrastructure? What if the USS Barb could sink a train? The crew's reaction to Fluckey's proposal ranged from enthusiastic to incredulous. Chief of the boat, Paul Golden Swiss Saunders, the most experienced submariner aboard and a veteran of all 12 of the Barb's war patrols since her commissioning, immediately volunteered. So did electrician's mate Billy R. Hatfield, whose childhood experience placing walnuts on railroad tracks to watch trains crack them open gave him an insight crucial to the mission's success. Every member of the crew volunteered, but Fluckey imposed strict criteria. He wanted only unmarried men, reasoning that if something went wrong, he didn't want to create widows. He preferred men with Boy Scout experience, figuring those who had learned land navigation and outdoor skills would have better chances of finding their way back if separated from the group. He needed men who could remain calm under extreme pressure and improvise solutions to unexpected problems. From dozens of volunteers, he selected 8: Paul G. Saunders, Billy R. Hatfield, Francis Neil Siver, Lawrence W. Newland, Edward W. Kling-Smith, James E. Richard, John Marcus, and Lieutenant William M. Walker. The planning began immediately, but one critical problem threatened the entire operation. How would they detonate the explosive? Originally, Fluckey considered having a crewman remain hidden near the tracks to manually trigger the charge when a train approached. The risks of this plan were obvious. The saboteur would need to evade Japanese patrols, find a hiding spot with a clear view of the tracks, wait for a train of unknown schedule, trigger the explosion at precisely the right moment, then escape through hostile territory back to the beach where the Barb might or might not still be waiting. The probability of capture or death was unacceptably high. Then Billy Hatfield spoke up with a memory from childhood. As a boy growing up along railroad tracks, Hatfield had placed walnuts between the ties, positioning them so the weight of passing trains would press down on the rails and crack the nuts open. He explained to Fluckey how even the heaviest trains caused rails to sag slightly under their weight, creating predictable downward pressure between any 2 ties. What if they used a micro-switch positioned between ties set so the natural sagging of the rail under a train's weight would close the circuit and detonate the charge? The train would blow itself up. No one needed to remain ashore. The saboteurs could plant the explosive, return to the submarine, and let physics do the rest. Fluckey immediately recognized the elegance of the solution. Hatfield not only had the idea, he had the electrical expertise to build the triggering mechanism. The impossible mission suddenly became merely extremely dangerous. The Barb screw transformed into an improvised weapons development laboratory. Since submarines carried no shovels or picks for digging, engineers cut up steel plates from the engine room's lower flats, then bent and welded them into serviceable digging tools. Hatfield rigged a 55 lb demolition charge, combining a scuttling charge with 3 batteries for power, all housed inside a watertight container. The micro-switch mechanism required careful calibration. Too sensitive, and the weight of wind or animals might trigger it prematurely. Too insensitive, and a train's weight might not activate it at all. Hatfield tested and retested the system, adjusting the tension until he was confident it would work. The crew fabricated everything needed for the mission from materials available on the submarine, demonstrating the same ingenuity that had characterized the Barb's entire service under Fly's command. While equipment was being prepared, Fluckey studied the coastal terrain and train schedules. For 3 nights, the Barb surfaced offshore after dark, and Fluckey observed the railroad through his periscope. He noted that trains passed at roughly predictable intervals, usually carrying between 12 and 20 cars. The schedule suggested trains ran every few hours during daylight and less frequently at night. The coastline featured several spots where the submarine could approach within 951 yd of shore without risking running around. The beach offered a gentle slope from the waterline to the railroad embankment approximately 400 yd inland. Trees and vegetation provided cover for the approach. The terrain offered escape routes if the saboteurs encountered Japanese patrols. Fluckey selected this location for the landing. Now they needed weather. The mission required cloud cover to conceal the submarine's approach and the landing party's movements. For 4 days, the crew waited while Fluckey anxiously watched the skies. Clear weather meant postponing the operation, and time was running out. The Barb's 12th patrol was scheduled to end soon, and Fluckey needed to return to Midway by August 2nd. Each day of waiting increased the chances they would have to abandon the mission. Then, on July 22nd, Fluckey noticed cirrus clouds building above the coastal mountains. White stratus clouds began capping the peaks. A weather front was moving in, bringing the cloud cover they needed. Fluckey made the decision. The mission would proceed that night. Shortly after midnight on July 23, 1945, the USS Barb surfaced 950 YD off the Carafe coast. In the darkness, the submarine's silhouette could easily be mistaken for a small patrol boat or schooner. Common sights in these waters. The crew lowered 2 rubber rafts to the water quietly, conscious that sound carried far over calm seas. The 8 saboteurs climbed down from the deck carrying the 55 lb explosive charge, the improvised digging tools, the micro-switch detonator, batteries, and weapons for self-defense. Commander Fluckey had considered giving them a dramatic Hollywood-style send-off, something memorable and inspiring. Instead, looking at these 8 men about to become the only American ground combat force to operate on Japanese home territory during the entire war, all he could think to say was practical advice. Boys, if you get stuck, head for Siberia, 130 north. Follow the mountain ranges. Good luck. The saboteurs paddled silently toward the shore, taking 25 minutes to cover the distance. As they approached the beach, they realized their navigation had been imperfect. Instead of landing on an isolated stretch of coastline, they came ashore with houses visible nearby. Fortunately, no dogs barked, though the sight of human and dog footprints in the sand alerted them that people lived in the area and posed potential danger. They pulled the rafts onto the beach and moved quickly inland, carrying their equipment and weapons. The darkness provided cover, but it also made navigation difficult. They had lost their points of reference during the approach and needed to reorient themselves to find the railroad tracks. Moving through unfamiliar terrain in enemy territory tested every man's nerve. They crossed small streams, pushed through vegetation, and climbed the embankment leading toward the railroad. The weight of the explosive and equipment slowed their progress. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, the snap of twigs underfoot, the rustle of leaves, their own breathing. They reached the railroad tracks after moving approximately 400 wid inland from the beach. Now came the critical work. Using the improvised tools, they began digging between 2 ties, excavating a hole deep enough to house the explosive charge and batteries. The ground was harder than anticipated, and progress was slow. Time pressed on them with physical weight. They needed to complete the work, return to the beach, and paddle back to the Barb before dawn exposed them to observation. As they worked, they heard something that stopped every heart. The distant whistle of an approaching train. The sound grew louder, and suddenly they could see a headlight in the distance growing brighter as the locomotive approached their position. They had not yet finished burying the explosive or setting the micro-switch trigger. 8 men froze, uncertain whether to abandon the mission or hide and hope the train crew didn't notice them. They chose to hide, pressing themselves into bushes mere feet from the tracks as the train thundered past. The ground shook from the locomotive's weight. They could see Japanese soldiers in the passenger cars, so close that any one of them glancing out a window at the right moment might have spotted the Americans. The train passed without incident, disappearing down the tracks. The saboteurs waited until the sound faded completely, then resumed their work with renewed urgency. They had been given a second chance and could not waste it. With the explosive charge and batteries positioned in the hole, Hatfield carefully connected the micro-switch mechanism. The device needed to sit between 2 ties with precise positioning so the rails downward, sag under train weight, would close the circuit without premature detonation. Hatfield made the final adjustments, tested the connections on last time, then covered everything with dirt. From the surface, the disturbed earth between the ties appeared unremarkable, just another section of railroad bed indistinguishable from hundreds of others stretching along the coast. The work was complete. Now they needed to leave before another train arrived or Japanese patrols discovered them. The 8 saboteurs moved quickly back toward the beach, retracing their route as best they could in darkness. They found the rafts where they had left them, climbed aboard, and began paddling toward the Barb's position offshore. At 1:32 hours, they signaled their departure from shore. Aboard the submarine, Commander Fluckey anxiously watched the shoreline through his periscope. The landing party had been ashore longer than planned. Every minute that passed increased the danger of discovery. The Barb sat vulnerable on the surface, unable to crash dive quickly with crew members still in the water. If Japanese patrol boats or aircraft appeared, Fluckey would face an impossible decision between his crew's safety and the lives of the 8 men returning from shore. He kept scanning the darkness, searching for the small rubber rafts against the black water. Then he saw them. 2 tiny shapes moving slowly across the calm surface. They were safe and returning. Relief swept through the submarine's crew, but the mission was not yet complete. They still needed to wait for a train. The saboteurs were halfway back to the submarine, paddling steadily through the darkness, when at 147 hours they got their answer. 15 minutes after departing the beach, they witnessed the result of their work. In the distance, a train whistle pierced the pre-dawn darkness. Through binoculars, the crew spotted a headlight approaching from the north, a locomotive pulling a long string of cars toward the exact spot where Hatfield's microswitch waited between the ties. The train grew closer, moving at standard speed, unaware of the trap ahead. Every man on the Barb held his breath. The locomotive reached the trigger point. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the explosive charge detonated with tremendous force. Commander Fluckey later described the moment in his memoir, Thunder Below. The boilers of the engine blew. Engine wreckage flying up some 200 ft, racing ahead of a mushroom of smoke, now white, now black. Cars piling up into and over the barrier of wreckage ahead, rolling off the track in a writhing, twisting chaos of Gordian knots. The blast illuminated the coastline like a miniature sun. Fragments of the locomotive soared 200 feet into the air, tumbling end over end before crashing back to earth. Train cars derailed and piled into a tangled heap of metal and wood. Secondary detonations erupted as the cargo ignited. The fireball lit up the submarine's position clearly enough that anyone on shore could have spotted them. But the Japanese were focused entirely on the catastrophic destruction of their train. The saboteurs, still paddling toward the Barb, watched in awe as their improvised device surpassed all expectations. Fluckey seized the intercom. All hands below deck not absolutely needed to maneuver the ship have permission to come topside. He didn't need to repeat the order. Hatches swung open and sailors flooded onto the deck to witness the distant fireworks display. The Barb had achieved the impossible. A submarine had destroyed a train. As the Barb moved away from the coast toward safer waters, the enormity of what they had accomplished began to sink in. This was not merely an unusual military feat. It was the only ground combat operation carried out by American forces on Japanese home soil during the entire Second World War. Kafuto, the southern part of Sakhalin Island, had been officially declared part of Japan's Naichi, or Inner Lands, in April 1943, granting it full home island status alongside Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. While American aircraft had bombed Japanese cities and submarines had torpedoed coastal shipping, no other U.S. military unit had ever landed personnel on Japanese sovereign territory to conduct sabotage. The 8 men who paddled ashore had done something without precedent in military history. Commander Fluckey's refusal to be bound by the limits of naval doctrine, coupled with his crew's creativity and courage, had created a moment that would become legendary in submarine warfare lore. The Barb continued her patrol for another week, carrying out further rocket strikes and shore bombardments. On July 24th, she launched 3 rocket salvos against factories at Shiratori on Sakhalin Island. On July 25th, the submarine shelled a cannery at Cherry with her deck guns, then conducted her final rocket attack against factories at Kashiho. On July 26th, the Barb attacked Shiburo on Kunashiri Island, destroying a lumber mill and sampan yard. She rammed and sank a trawler after setting it ablaze, then captured 3 Japanese prisoners. The bold campaign proved that even in the closing weeks of the war, American submarines remained offensive weapons capable of striking freely along Japan's coastline. The Barb arrived at Midway Atoll on August 2, 1945, her 12th war patrol complete. The submarine had endured roughly 400 shells, bombs, and depth charges during her last 5 patrols under Fluckey's command, surviving close calls that should have doomed her. Yet she returned without a single casualty. Not one member of her crew had earned a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat during any of her patrols. Commander Fluckey received his 4th Navy Cross for the 12th Patrol, bringing his total decorations to 1 Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses, making him among the most decorated officers in U.S. Navy history. The Barb received a Navy Unit Commendation for her final patrol, adding to the 4 Presidential Unit citations she had already earned. The submarine's battle flag, raised upon her return from patrol, told the story of her remarkable service. The flag displayed patches representing each major achievement. 17 confirmed ship sinkings, the Presidential Unit Citation ribbons, the Medal of Honor ribbon honoring Fluckey's decoration, and most uniquely, the silhouette of a Japanese locomotive. No other submarine in any Navy's history had ever earned the right to display a train on its battle flag. Photographers captured the 8 saboteurs at Pearl Harbor, holding the battle flag and grinning proudly, an image that became iconic, symbolizing not just one mission, but the entire spirit of bold innovation that defined submarine warfare in the Pacific. The statistics of the Barb's service under commander. Fluckey set records that showed what could be achieved when tactical creativity met technical skill and crew dedication. During the 5 patrols Fluckey commanded from May 1944 to August 1945, the Barb was officially credited with sinking 17 enemy vessels totaling 96,628 tons. According to post-war assessments by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, this included the escort carrier Uno, one of only 4 Japanese carriers sunk by American submarines during the entire war, along with numerous cargo ships, tankers, and patrol vessels. The tonnage total placed Fluckey among the top submarine commanders in terms of enemy shipping destroyed, an extraordinary record by any standard. Beyond the numbers, the Barb's significance lay in proving how submarines could evolve beyond their conventional role. Fluckey demonstrated that submarines could infiltrate heavily defended harbors, escape at speeds once thought impossible, launch rockets at coastal targets, conduct humanitarian rescues in combat zones, and send landing teams ashore for sabotage missions. Each of these operations challenged established ideas about submarine warfare. Naval doctrine adapted to incorporate lessons from the Barb's exploits. Future submarine officers studied Fluckey's tactics, and the daring spirit he embodied became part of the submarine force's culture. The Barb's legacy extended well beyond wartime. After hostilities ended, the submarine was placed in commissioned reserve on March 9, 1946, then decommissioned on February 12, 1947, at New London, Connecticut. She was recommissioned on December 3, 1951, and assigned to the Atlantic Fleet operating out of Key West, Florida. After being decommissioned again on February 5, 1954, she underwent Guppy conversion, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, which modernized WO2 submarines with streamlined hulls and snorkels for extended submerged operations. She was recommissioned on August 3, 1954, for final service before being permanently decommissioned on December 13, 1954. Under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, the Barb was loaned to Italy and renamed Enrico Tazzoli, serving in the Italian Navy until 1972, when she was sold for scrap for about $100,000. Admiral Fluckey later remarked that, had the crew known of the sale, they would have bought the submarine themselves and brought her back to the United States as a museum ship, preserving her legacy for future generations. Eugene Fluckey's career continued with distinction after leaving the Barb. He became an aide to Navy Secretary James Forrestal and Admiral Chester Nimitz, Chief of Naval Operations. From June 1964 to June 1966, he commanded the submarine force, Pacific Fleet, overseeing all Pacific submarines during a critical period of the Cold War. In July 1966, he became Director of Naval Intelligence, providing strategic analysis during the Vietnam War era. 2 years later, he was appointed Chief of the Military Assistance Advisory Group in Portugal, serving there until his retirement as a Rear Admiral on August 1, 1972. His post-military years reflected the same spirit of service that had defined his naval career. In 1974, he and his wife Marjorie began running an orphanage in Portugal, continuing until her death in 1979 after 42 years of marriage. He later married Margaret in 1980, and together they continued the orphanage's work until it closed in 1982. In 1992, Fluckey published his memoir, Thunder Below. The USS Barb revolutionizes submarine warfare in World War II, offering detailed accounts of the submarine's operations and his tactical philosophy. The book became essential reading for submarine officers and naval historians, preserving the Barb's extraordinary story for future generations. Fluckey remained active in naval affairs and submarine reunions until his death in Annapolis, Maryland, on June 28, 2007. At age 93, he was laid to rest at the U.S. Naval Academy Cemetery, among the great naval heroes who shaped America's maritime power. His passing marked the end of an era, the loss of one of the last great World War II submarine commanders, whose innovation and daring redefined undersea warfare. The 8 saboteurs who paddled ashore near Kashiho on that July night in 1945 lived their lives knowing they had been part of something singular in military history. Paul G. Saunders, the chief of the boat whose skill and leadership made the mission possible, became one of the Navy's most decorated enlisted men. His awards included 2 Silver Stars, 1 Bronze Star, a Presidential Unit Citation, a Navy Unit Commendation, and numerous campaign medals. He remained proud throughout his life of his service aboard the Barb and his role in the train demolition. Billy R. Hatfield, whose childhood memory of cracking walnuts on railroad tracks inspired the mission's key technical solution, never forgot the instant his improvised microswitch triggered the explosion that obliterated the train. The remaining 6 men, Francis N. Sever, Lawrence W. Newland, Edward W. Klingeth, James E. Richard, John Marcus, and Lieutenant William M. Walker, returned to civilian life carrying the knowledge that they had achieved something no other Americans could claim. The historical importance of the train demolition has only grown over time as historians have come to recognize its singular place in World War II history. While U.S. forces conducted countless amphibious assaults and ground operations across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, those campaigns took place on islands Japan had conquered. The Japanese home islands themselves remained untouched by ground combat. With one exception, 8 men from the USS Barb landed on Kafuto, Japanese home soil, planted explosives, and destroyed enemy infrastructure before escaping to sea. The operation proved that even Japan's homeland was vulnerable to American attack, shattering the illusion of safety. Its impact was psychological more than material. Destroying one train did not change Japan's war capacity in July 1945. By then, U.S. bombing raids had already leveled cities, crippled industry, and severed supply lines. The Japanese military was preparing for what they expected would be a massive Allied invasion of the home islands, planning to use every available resource, including civilian militia, to resist the landing forces. One demolished train barely registered in the larger strategic picture, but the symbolic impact was profound. If American submarines could send landing parties ashore to blow up trains, what else might they do? If the coastline was vulnerable to sabotage, how many troops would Japan need to dedicate to coastal defense rather than preparing for the expected invasion? The operation succeeded in creating uncertainty and forcing Japanese commanders to consider threats they had previously dismissed as impossible. The timing of the operation, occurring just weeks before Japan's surrender, has led some historians to question whether it was necessary. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, forced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender documents were signed on September 2 in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri. Military analysts have long debated whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war, or whether Japan was already on the verge of surrender due to conventional bombing. naval blockade, and diplomatic pressure. The Barb's train demolition occurred in this context just 2 weeks before the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. Some have suggested that continuing aggressive submarine operations in late July 1945 unnecessarily risked American lives when the war's end was imminent. Others argue that until Japan actually surrendered, American forces had a duty to maintain maximum pressure through all available means. The broader context of American submarine warfare in the Pacific provides the frame for understanding the Barb's achievements. American submarines entered the war poorly equipped and hampered by defective torpedoes. The Mark I 14 torpedo, which equipped most submarines in 1941 and 1942, suffered from multiple serious problems. The magnetic exploder often detonated prematurely or failed to detonate at all. The contact exploder frequently failed to trigger upon impact. The torpedoes ran deeper than set depth, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. These defects were not fully corrected until late 1943, costing American submariners countless lost opportunities and putting them at severe risk as they pressed attacks that should have sunk enemy ships, but resulted only in revealing their positions. Despite these handicaps, American submarines gradually strangled Japan's economy by sinking the Merchant. Vessels that transported raw materials and finished goods between Japan and its conquered territories. The statistics of American submarine warfare demonstrate the decisive impact of undersea operations on Japan's ability to wage war. American submarines sank 2,314. Japanese vessels comprising 1,113 merchant ships and 201 naval vessels totaling approximately 5.32 million tons, according to the official Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee post-war evaluation. This represented roughly 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war. They also sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and numerous destroyers and submarines. This came at significant cost. The United States lost 52 submarines during the war, 51 in the Pacific and 1 in the Atlantic, the highest loss rate of any branch of the American military. Approximately 22% of American submariners who served in combat did not return with 374 officers and 3,131 enlisted men killed, a casualty rate that exceeded even that of Marine infantry. The men who volunteered for submarine duty knew they faced extraordinary dangers in a branch of service where there was no such thing as a minor accident. A submarine could be lost with all hands due to equipment failure, enemy action, or simple miscalculation, and recovery of remains was usually impossible. The cultural impact of the Barb's train demolition has persisted in American naval tradition and popular culture. The story has been retold in countless books, articles, and documentaries about submarine warfare. It appears in Naval Academy curricula as an example of tactical innovation. The image of the battle flag with the train silhouette has become iconic, representing the spirit of aggressive action that characterized the American submarine force in the Pacific. In reunions and ceremonies, surviving crew members of the Barb have been honored for their service, particularly the 8 saboteurs who conducted the only ground combat operation on Japanese home territory. The story has entered submarine force culture as an example of what can be accomplished when commanders think beyond traditional limitations and crews, demonstrate the ingenuity and courage to execute unconventional operations. Modern submarine operations have evolved far beyond what Commander Fluckey and the Barb's crew could have imagined in 1945. Nuclear-powered submarines can remain submerged for months, carrying ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads or cruise missiles that can strike targets hundreds of miles inland. Submarine-launched Tomahawk missiles represent the evolution of Fly's rocket launchers, precision weapons that can be fired from underwater to destroy specific buildings from hundreds of miles away. Modern submarines carry sophisticated electronics that would seem like science fiction to World War II submariners. Yet, despite all these technological advances, the fundamental principles that Fluckey demonstrated remain valid. Aggressive action, tactical innovation, crew excellence, and willingness to attempt operations beyond conventional doctrine. continue to characterize the most successful submarine operations. The spirit of the Barb lives on in every submarine that pushes the boundaries of what is considered possible. The fate of the 8 saboteurs and the other crew members of the Barb after the war reflected the experiences of millions of American servicemen who returned to civilian life. They had witnessed and participated in events of extraordinary historical significance. Yet most resumed normal lives, raised families, pursued careers, and rarely spoke about their wartime service except with fellow veterans who understood. The heroism and innovation that characterized their service aboard the Barb did not translate easily to civilian contexts. How do you explain to someone who has never served on a submarine what it feels like to navigate through a mined harbor at night, knowing that one wrong calculation means death for everyone aboard? How do you convey the terror and exhilaration of paddling through enemy waters to plant explosives on a railroad, fully aware that capture means torture and execution? Most chose not to try, keeping their experiences private, except on rare occasions when circumstances brought them together with the men who had shared those moments. The battle flag of the USS Barb remains on display at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, where visitors can see the train silhouette and read about the submarine's extraordinary service. The flag serves as a tangible connection to a moment in history when 8 men paddled through darkness onto enemy shores to accomplish something that military doctrine said was impossible. Looking at that flag, visitors can imagine the scene. The submarine surfacing in hostile waters, the rubber rafts being lowered silently, the saboteurs paddling toward an uncertain fate, the anxious waiting aboard the Barb, and the spectacular explosion that announced success. The flag represents more than one mission. It symbolizes the spirit of innovation and aggressive action that characterized American submarine warfare in the Pacific and demonstrates what can be accomplished when leadership encourages rather than constrains creative thinking. The story of how one submarine's impossible raid blew up a train in Japan ultimately teaches lessons that transcend military history. It demonstrates that limitations often exist more in assumptions than in reality, that conventional thinking about what is possible can be challenged successfully, that technical problems can be solved through ingenuity when intelligent people are given freedom to innovate, and that leadership willing to take calculated risks can achieve results that conservative approaches never reach. Commander Eugene Flaky's greatest contribution was not the tonnage he sank or even the Medal of Honor he earned. It was proving that the rule book of submarine warfare was incomplete, that submarines could do far more than doctrine specified, and that the only real limitation was imagination combined with courage. The 8 men who paddled ashore on July 23, 1945, had no way of knowing that their mission would become legendary. They were simply submariners following orders from a commander they trusted, attempting an operation that seemed barely feasible, but worth trying because their commander believed it possible. When the train exploded at 147 hours and pieces of locomotive flew 200 feet into the air, they experienced a moment of pure vindication. The impossible had become real. A submarine had sunk a train. That moment would be frozen in history, commemorated on battle flags, recorded in books studied at Naval, and remembered as proof that with sufficient skill, courage, and innovation, even the most improbable missions can succeed. The USS Barb's greatest legacy is not found in statistics of tonnage sunk or decorations earned. It lives in the inspiration provided to future generations of military personnel who face their own impossible missions and remember that there once was a submarine that sank a train. The Barb demonstrated that submarines were not limited to attacking ships in open water. They could penetrate defended harbors that should have been suicide traps. They could launch rockets at shore installations like surface warships. They could rescue drowning prisoners in typhoon conditions. They could send men ashore to blow up trains on enemy territory. Each of these accomplishments expanded the definition of what submarines could achieve. Commander Flaky's philosophy permeated every aspect of the Barb's operations. He believed that submarines should take the offensive whenever possible, that risks could be calculated and managed rather than simply avoided, that crew ingenuity should be encouraged rather than constrained by rigid procedures, and that the best defense was often an aggressive offense that kept the enemy off balance. This philosophy produced results that spoke for themselves. The Barb sank more tonnage under Fell's command than most submarines achieved in their entire service lives. She conducted operations that other commanders considered impossible. She survived situations that should have resulted in her loss, and she did all of this without losing a single crew member to enemy action. The relationship between Fluckey and his crew exemplified the best traditions of naval leadership. He demanded excellence but provided the tools and authority his men needed to achieve it. He took responsibility for failures and shared credit for successes. He treated his crew with respect and genuine concern for their welfare, reportedly keeping cases of beer in the enlisted showers to reward successful engagements despite regulations. His men responded with absolute loyalty and willingness to attempt missions that would have seemed suicidal under less capable leadership. They trusted Fluckey because he had proven repeatedly that his unconventional tactics worked, that his calculations of risk were accurate, and that he would get them home safely. The technical innovations that made the train demolition possible reflected the same creative problem-solving that characterized all of the Barb's operations. Faced with the need for digging tools, the crew fabricated them from steel plates. Confronted with the challenge of detonating an explosive without leaving someone ashore, Billy Hatfield remembered childhood experiences and adapted them into a functional trigger mechanism. Required to test and calibrate sensitive equipment with limited resources, the crew worked through multiple iterations until they achieved the precise sensitivity needed. These solutions came not from following established procedures, but from intelligent men given the freedom to innovate and the confidence that their ideas would be seriously considered. The train mission also demonstrated the importance of patience and timing in military operations. Fluckey spent 3 nights observing the railroad before committing to the mission. He waited 4 days for weather conditions that would provide adequate cloud cover. He selected his landing party based on careful criteria designed to maximize their chances of success and minimize the consequences of failure. He planned the operation in meticulous detail while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. This combination of thorough preparation and tactical flexibility characterized Fluckey's entire approach to submarine warfare. The psychological impact of the mission extended beyond its immediate military effects. Japanese commanders who learned of the train demolition faced uncomfortable questions. If American submarines could land saboteurs who successfully destroyed infrastructure and escaped, what other vulnerabilities existed along Japan's extensive coastline? How many troops would need to be diverted from defending against the expected invasion to patrol thousands of miles of shore? Could submarine-launched raiders strike at any time and place of their choosing? These questions had no satisfactory answers, and the uncertainty they created had strategic value beyond the tactical destruction of one train. The mission also represented the culmination of the Barb's evolution under Fluckey's command. From a submarine with an unremarkable record in her first 7 patrols, the Barb transformed into the most innovative and aggressive submarine in the Pacific Fleet. This transformation occurred not through changes in equipment or personnel, but through leadership that encouraged rather than constrained excellence. Fluffy's willingness to attempt operations that other commanders dismissed as impossible created a culture aboard the Barb where innovation was expected and remarkable achievements became routine. The contrast between the Barb's early patrols and her performance under Fluckey highlights the decisive role of leadership in military effectiveness. The submarine herself remained largely unchanged. The basic crew skills and technical capabilities were comparable. What changed was the commander's vision of what submarines could accomplish and his willingness to test the boundaries if possible. This transformation suggests that many military units operate below their potential capacity, not because of limitations in equipment or personnel but because of limitations in imagination and willingness to take calculated risks. The story of the USS Barb and her impossible raid also serves as a reminder that military innovation, often comes from practitioners rather than theorists. Naval doctrine manuals did not suggest that submarines should attack trains. No staff college curriculum included lessons on submarine-launched ground operations. The idea came from a commander observing a tactical opportunity and asking why not, rather than accepting conventional wisdom about what submarines did. This pattern of innovation, driven by operational commanders willing to question doctrine, has characterized military evolution throughout history. The train mission's success vindicated Fly's entire philosophy of submarine warfare. Critics within the submarine force had questioned some of his more aggressive tactics, suggesting that he took unnecessary risks and that his success reflected luck rather than skill. The train demolition demonstrated that Flaky's success came from careful calculation, thorough preparation, crew excellence, and tactical innovation rather than reckless gambling. The mission succeeded because every aspect was carefully planned and executed from equipment fabrication to timing to escape routes. The fact that it appeared impossible beforehand reflected limitations in conventional thinking rather than genuine impossibility. The broader significance of the USS Barb service under Eugene Fluckey extends beyond World War II submarine operations. The Barb demonstrated principles that remain relevant to military operations today. Mission success depends on leadership that encourages innovation. Crews trained to think creatively rather than simply follow procedures. Willingness to attempt operations outside established doctrine when tactical advantage justifies the risk. Thorough preparation combined with flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. And cultivation of organizational culture that expects excellence and treats remarkable achievements as attainable rather than exceptional. These principles transcend specific technologies or tactical situations. They apply equally to nuclear submarines, surface warships, aircraft operations, ground combat, and special operations forces. The USS Barb's legacy lives on wherever military personnel push beyond conventional limitations to achieve objectives that initially appear impossible. Every successful special operations mission, every innovative tactical solution, every commander who questions whether doctrine adequately addresses the current situation reflects the spirit that Eugene Fluckey brought to submarine warfare in 1944 and 1945. The story of the submarine that sank a train remains compelling decades after the event because it captures fundamental truths about human capability and achievement. When people work together toward a common goal. When leadership encourages rather than constrains creativity. When technical problems are viewed as challenges to overcome rather than insurmountable obstacles. Remarkable things become possible. The 8 men who paddled ashore onto enemy territory and successfully destroyed a train proved that courage, ingenuity, and determination can accomplish missions that appear impossible beforehand. The USS Barb returned from her 12th war patrol, having revolutionized submarine warfare in ways that would influence naval operations for decades. She proved that submarines could successfully employ rockets against shore installations, a capability that evolved into modern submarine-launched cruise missiles. She demonstrated that submarines could penetrate heavily defended anchorages that should have been death traps, validating aggressive tactics that would be studied and emulated by future submarine commanders. She showed that submarines could conduct humanitarian rescue operations in combat zones, setting precedents for submarine involvement in rescue and recovery missions. And she proved that submarines could send landing parties ashore to conduct sabotage operations, expanding the definition of submarine warfare beyond attacking ships at sea. Each of these innovations challenged existing doctrine and required convincing skeptical superior officers that unconventional operations were worth attempting. Fluffy's success in achieving approval for his most audacious operations reflected his credibility earned through consistent success, his ability to articulate clear tactical rationale for unconventional approaches, his demonstrated skill in calculating and managing risk, and his track record of bringing his crew home safely despite conducting operations other commanders considered suicidal. This credibility gave him latitude to tempt missions that would have been denied to less proven commanders. The relationship between innovation and credibility in military organizations deserves emphasis. New approaches and unconventional tactics face inherent skepticism in organizations. Built on tradition and proven procedures, innovators must establish credibility through consistent success before they gain authority to attempt truly revolutionary operations. Flies rise from capable submarine commander to groundbreaking tactical innovator followed this same trajectory. His initial successes in relatively conventional missions built his credibility. That credibility then granted him the freedom to pursue bolder tactics, which produced further victories that amplified his reputation. This positive feedback cycle culminated in authorization for operations like the train demolition, missions that would likely have been rejected if proposed by officers with less proven records. Any final evaluation of the USS Barb's service under Eugene Fluckey must recognize both its extraordinary accomplishments and their context within the broader Pacific submarine campaign. The Barb was one of roughly 250 submarines active in the Pacific during World War II. While her record was remarkable, many others also achieved impressive outcomes through aggressive maneuvers and tactical expertise. The difference was one of degree, not kind. What made the Barb exceptional was the sustained excellence across numerous patrols, the variety of innovative tactics successfully executed, and the symbolic power of missions like the train demolition that captured the public imagination. Still, the Barb's triumphs also reflected advantages unavailable to many others. She operated late enough in the war to benefit from corrected torpedoes, upgraded radar and electronics, refined tactics drawn from 3 years of combat experience, and weakened Japanese anti-submarine defenses as their navies suffered mounting losses. Earlier boats fought with faulty torpedoes against a stronger adversary. The Barb's record, while outstanding, rested upon the groundwork laid by submarines that achieved less dazzling success under harsher conditions. This perspective does not lessen the Barb's achievements. It places them in their rightful frame. Her success reflected the fusion of Eugene Fluckey's tactical brilliance, an exceptional crew, technological progress, mature doctrine, and favorable strategic timing. Remove any one of these factors, and the outcome would have changed. The Barb's story is not merely about a single inspired commander or remarkable crew, but about the evolution of an entire system of submarine warfare that reached peak effectiveness by 1945, the lasting appeal of the USS Barb and her audacious raid on a Japanese train speaks to universal themes that reach beyond military history. People are captivated by tales of underdogs achieving improbable victories, of creativity overcoming impossible odds, of bravery and resolve prevailing against all expectations, and of teamwork accomplishing what individuals could not. The Barb's story embodies all of these, set against the dramatic backdrop of submarine warfare during the world's greatest and most devastating conflict. The vision of 8 men paddling through darkness toward enemy shores, carrying improvised explosives to strike a target no submarine had ever dared to engage, stirs the imagination more deeply than statistics of tonnage sunk ever could. The human dimension, the fear they surely felt, the ingenuity required to solve technical challenges, the split-second decision to hide instead of abort when the first train passed, and the relief when the explosion confirmed success, makes the story unforgettable. These men were not superhuman warriors but ordinary sailors placed in extraordinary circumstances, who rose to the occasion through courage, skill, and unity. The Barb's legacy endures in the submarine force ethos that prizes bold initiative, tactical creativity, measured risk-taking, and crew excellence. Every submarine commander facing a tactical choice must weigh caution against daring, the safety of restraint versus the potential reward of action. The Barb reminds them that the greatest feats in submarine warfare were accomplished by leaders willing to attempt what once seemed impossible. This cultural inheritance may be her most enduring contribution, inspiring generations of officers to question whether existing doctrine truly fits present conditions, and whether unconventional thinking might yield better results. The tale of the submarine that destroyed a train in Japan closes with a recognition that military greatness springs from the union of visionary leadership, skilled personnel, technological advancement, refined doctrine, and favorable circumstance. The USS Barb possessed all these elements during her final 5 war patrols under Eugene Fluckey's command. The result was a record of success that ranks among the finest in submarine history, and a legacy that continues to inspire military professionals more than 75 years later. The submarine that sank a train proved that with courage, ingenuity, and determination, even the most impossible missions can succeed.